The Baltic winds carried the sound of retreat. By the spring of 1944, the German Army Group North had been fighting for nearly 3 years across the endless forests and marshes of Russia and the Baltic states. What began as a triumphant march toward Leningrad had become a slow drowning in snow, mud, and blood. When the Red Army finally broke through the siege ring around Leningrad that January, the German front began to crumble. The men who had once believed they could conquer the Soviet Union now fought simply to stay alive. By July, Soviet offensives were rolling west like a tide. The great encirclements that had once been Germany's trademark were now being used against them. Stalin's generals wanted to destroy Army Group North completely, to cut it off from the rest of the Wehrmacht, seal it against the Baltic Sea, and crush it in place. For the men of the 16th and 18th Armies, 500,000 soldiers, the order was simple: hold the line. But there was no line anymore, only fragments. Whole divisions were reduced to scattered battalions. Commanders moved their headquarters daily, trying to stay ahead of Soviet artillery. Villages burned, frozen corpses marked the roads, and supply convoys vanished in the forests. By August, Soviet tanks had reached the Gulf of Riga. The Germans were split in two, one part still fighting in Estonia, the other retreating into Latvia. Hitler forbade any withdrawal. He declared that not one step back applied as much to his own armies as it once had to Stalin's. The Führer insisted that the Baltic coast was vital for Germany's submarine bases and future counterattacks. When his generals warned that their retreating troops would be trapped, he replied coldly, "Then they will hold out where they stand. They will make history." The trap slammed shut in October 1944. Soviet armies advancing from the south captured the Latvian city of Jelgava, cutting off the only rail link to East Prussia. The remnants of 30 German divisions were sealed in what would become known as the Courland Pocket, a thin strip of land between the Baltic Sea and the Gulf of Riga. Inside that pocket were roughly 500,000 men, soldiers, air crews, naval units, cooks, clerks, and wounded. They had artillery but little ammunition, tanks but almost no fuel, planes but nowhere to land. They were surrounded by nearly 700,000 Soviet troops, with thousands of guns and aircraft. Yet Hitler refused to let them break out. He told their commander, General Ferdinand Schörner, that Courland would become an impregnable fortress, a symbol of German willpower. Schörner obeyed. He was known for his fanaticism, his cruelty, and his refusal to tolerate retreat. His men called him the Bloodhound. But even Schörner couldn't change the reality. Courland was a frozen graveyard. As the first Soviet assaults crashed against the perimeter in October, the Germans fought back like cornered wolves. The 16th Army, reduced to skeleton divisions, used every tree line and frozen ditch as a defensive wall. For weeks, artillery thundered across the forests. The sky was filled with black smoke and snow. Soviet tanks charged through minefields, while German anti-tank guns flared from hidden positions. At night, tracer rounds lit up the darkness like fireflies. The wounded froze to death where they fell. When the first Soviet offensive stalled, the Red Army simply regrouped and attacked again. Between October 1944 and April 1945, there would be 6 major battles for Courland, 6 waves of attacks, each one meant to finish the job. Each time the Germans repelled them, but at a cost that could never be replaced. By December, food was running out. Ammunition came only by sea, from convoys that risked Soviet submarines in the icy Baltic. Soldiers ate horse meat and melted snow. Hospitals overflowed. The wounded lay in unheated barns, wrapped in rags. Letters from home stopped coming. Radios brought only Hitler's speeches, promising victory from bunkers hundreds of miles away. For many soldiers, Courland began to feel like a world that time had forgotten. The forests were filled with ghosts, the ghosts of comrades lost since 1941, of towns burned, of dreams of victory long dead. Men carved grave in the frozen earth and whispered to themselves that the war must surely end soon. But it never did. Instead, new Soviet offensives kept coming. The Germans called them the Courland waves. Each one smashed into their lines, and each time the survivors pushed them back. By January 1945, Schörner reported to Hitler that his men had destroyed over 2,000 Soviet tanks and inflicted hundreds of thousands of casualties. But the truth was darker. The Red Army could replace every tank, every man. The Germans could not. Every victory in Courland was an illusion, a delay, not salvation. By the end of the winter, the soldiers began to realize something terrifying. They were fighting for nothing. The Soviet front had already moved deep into East Prussia. The Red Army was on the Oder River, within artillery range of Berlin itself. And yet, the 500,000 men of Army Group Courland were still trapped, still holding out in a forgotten corner of Europe. Cut off out of supplies, with no strategic purpose, they had become ghosts of a lost army left to vanish beneath the snow. The Baltic winds howled through their trenches. The frozen forests echoed with the sound of distant artillery. And every soldier wondered the same thing. Would anyone even remember them? The first snow came early. By late October 1944, the fields of Latvia were already turning white, and the sound of the guns echoed for miles across the frozen marshes. For the trapped soldiers of Army Group Courland, the coming of winter meant both relief and terror. The snow would slow the Soviet tanks, but it would also freeze the wounded, seize the engines, and turn every river into a glittering death trap. The men joked bitterly that even the weather had chosen sides. In the dark pine forests near Tukums, German infantry crouched in trenches carved out of permafrost. Their coats were stiff with ice, their boots wrapped in burlap to stop them from freezing to the metal floorboards. Each day, they watched the eastern horizon flicker red as Soviet artillery began its morning ritual. At first came the distant thunder, then a rising scream as shells tore through the air and exploded in geysers of snow and earth. One soldier later wrote, "We stopped hearing the explosions after a while. You only felt them, a dull pressure in your chest, like someone hitting you from inside your own body. When the barrage ended, the Red Army would come. Through the smoke and snow they appeared, dark silhouettes moving across the fields, hundreds of them, followed by the rattling of T-34 tanks. The Germans fired until the barrels of their MG-42s glowed red. Machine guns mowed down wave after wave, yet still they came, stepping over the bodies of the fallen, shouting, firing, advancing. Sometimes, Soviet flamethrower teams crawled forward through the snow. When they fired, the entire battlefield erupted in color, white snow, black smoke, and walls of orange fire that rolled over the trenches. The smell of burning flesh lingered for days. In these moments, courage and madness became the same thing. German soldiers who had survived Stalingrad said that Courland felt worse, colder, lonelier, more pointless. They weren't fighting to take ground anymore. They were fighting to stay where they were. The commanders kept repeating Hitler's promise. Reinforcements are coming. The Führer has not forgotten you. But the reinforcements never came. Supplies arrived by sea when the weather allowed. Convoys of small freighters and navy barges crossed from Gotenhafen and Königsberg under cover of darkness. Each trip was a gamble. Soviet submarines prowled the Baltic, and planes hunted anything that moved on the water. When a ship was hit, there were no survivors. Those who reached the shore unloaded crates of ammunition, medical kits, and sacks of black bread frozen solid. Then the ships vanished again into the fog, leaving the soldiers staring at the grey sea, their only lifeline and their only escape. December brought the second Soviet offensive. It began before dawn on the 21st, the sky flashing red above the forests near Saldus. Soviet artillery had learned every German position by heart. When the barrage lifted, entire companies had ceased to exist. Trenches collapsed. Men were buried alive. The survivors stumbled out to face the next wave, tanks followed by infantry, then more tanks, more infantry. At one crossroad, a German battalion held off 3 Soviet brigades for 2 days before being overrun. When relief troops arrived, they found only 20 men still standing. The rest were frozen where they fell, rifles still clutched in their hands. By January, temperatures plunged to 30 degrees C. Frostbite became the silent killer. A man could lose a finger by touching his rifle barrel without gloves. Medic stations were full of amputations. The stench of gangrene filled the barns and cellars that served as hospitals. One doctor recorded performing 30 surgeries in a single night with no anesthesia, only vodka and prayer. Bodies were stacked outside because the ground was too hard to dig grave. And yet, the fighting never stopped. Every few weeks, the Soviet artillery would start again, a dull rumble building to a scream, followed by the charge of infantry through the drifting snow. The German lines bent, shattered, and reformed again. Courland became a graveyard that refused to die. Soviet reports described the defenders as fanatics. But the truth was simpler. They had nowhere to go. For the Germans, retreat meant the sea. For the Soviets, retreat meant Stalin's wrath. So both sides fought until exhaustion, until neither could tell victory from survival. By February 1945, the war had moved far beyond them. The Red Army had crossed the Vistula. Berlin itself was within reach. And yet, the 500,000 men of Courland still fought on, trading shells and bullets for land that meant nothing. Hitler continued to send radio messages, congratulating them on their heroic stand. In one infamous transmission, he promised, "When the time is right, Courland will strike again. You will be the anvil upon which Germany's enemies are broken." But the soldiers listening in their dugouts no longer believed him. They knew the truth. They were not the anvil. They were the sacrifice. In the forests near Dobel, a young machine gunner named Karl Müller wrote in his diary, "They say we hold the line for Germany. But Germany is gone. My family writes from ruins. What are we holding for? He was 19 years old. He died 3 days later, buried under a snowdrift. Meanwhile, Soviet propaganda units began dropping leaflets over the lines. Some were printed in perfect German. German soldiers, surrender. The war is over for you. You will live. Your generals will not. Others showed drawings of soldiers sitting by fires with food and cigarettes, the promise of warmth, of survival. Many Germans kept the leaflets in their pockets, not as invitations, but as reminders of what they no longer had. The Fifth Soviet Offensive came in March. It was the most brutal yet. The Red Army threw 20 divisions into the pocket, supported by over 1,000 artillery guns and hundreds of tanks. The air was filled with a constant roar, the howl of Katyusha rockets, the deep thump of heavy shells, the scream of dive bombers. Entire forests were shredded to splinters. When the smoke cleared, nothing moved. For 3 weeks, the Germans fought from one tree line to the next, falling back, regrouping, counterattacking, falling back again. By the end of March, both sides were exhausted. The Soviets had lost thousands of men. The Germans had lost hope. Then came the thaw. The snow melted, and the ground turned to liquid mud. Tanks sank. Trucks bogged down. The roads disappeared under a brown river of slush. It was spring, the season when most soldiers longed for life. But in Courland, spring meant only one thing: the final offensive. As April approached, everyone knew the next Soviet attack would decide everything. In Berlin, the Red Army was preparing to storm Hitler's capital. In Courland, 500,000 Germans still sat in their trenches, waiting for orders that would never save them. And as the last snow faded from the pine forests, the ground began to thaw, revealing what winter had hidden. The fields were full of bones. April 1945. The Baltic Sea had thawed, but the air still smelled of iron and smoke. To the east, Berlin was already burning. But here, on this frozen edge of Europe, the war refused to die. In the Courland pocket, 500,000 German soldiers were still under arms, an entire army frozen in time, fighting a war that the rest of the world had already left behind. For the Soviets, it was an irritation, a festering wound they were determined to close. For the Germans, it was a prison. At dawn on April 16th, the horizon flashed white. Then came the sound, a deep, rolling thunder that never ended. The Red Army had launched its sixth and final offensive. In Berlin, Zhukov's troops were breaking through the Oder line. In Courland, General Bagramian's First Baltic Front began its own assault, determined to finish what 6 months of blood and snow had failed to achieve. Over 1,000 Soviet guns opened fire along a 50-kilometer front. The bombardment shook the earth. Birds took flight from the forests in clouds that dissolved into the smoke. A German lieutenant, trapped near Skrunda, wrote in his diary, "The sky is one single explosion. There is no horizon, no day or night. Only noise and shaking ground. The earth feels alive, but angry." When the bombardment ended, the Red Army came forward, an ocean of men in brown greatcoats, tanks grinding through mud, their tracks throwing up waves of black soil. The Germans opened fire with everything they had left. 88mm guns boomed from tree lines. Machine guns rattled from dugouts, packed with sandbags and frozen bodies. The two armies collided with the violence of thunder. The Sixth Battle of Courland lasted 3 weeks. It was not the biggest battle of the war, but it was among the most hopeless. German soldiers fought for hills that had already been captured and recaptured half a dozen times. Each map looked the same forests, the same rivers, the same towns reduced to rubble. The difference was in the names scrawled across the rosters. Each week, new replacements arrived from the remnants of shattered divisions. Teenagers, old men, naval reservists. One captured Soviet report described it perfectly. They are ghosts with rifles. They fight as if they have forgotten why. On April 20th, Hitler's birthday, radio operators in Courland picked up the Führer's final broadcast. He spoke of final victory and the steel will of the German soldier. His voice cracked halfway through the speech, but the transmission continued, a desperate attempt to sound powerful from the depths of his bunker. In the trenches, no one cheered. Most men simply turned down the volume and looked at one another in silence. That night, Soviet aircraft dropped leaflets over the pocket. They read, "Hitler is dead. Berlin burns. You are alone. Surrender and live." The Germans didn't believe it, not yet. But in the morning, when they tried to contact headquarters in Berlin, there was only static. Then, on April 30th, the message came through the chain of command. Hitler was gone. Berlin was surrounded. The Reich was finished. In the forests of Courland, the news spread like wind through the trenches. Some men laughed. Some wept. Some loaded their rifles and walked into the trees, never to return. For the first time, officers spoke openly of surrender. General Schörner, still commanding the region from East Prussia, sent orders. The Courland army will continue to fight. The Führers will remain our command. But the men knew better. Schörner's words were echoes of a dead man. In early May, Soviet patrols began broadcasting with loudspeakers. The war is over. Germany has surrendered. Lay down your arms. At first, no one moved. The sound of artillery still rolled through the forests. The habit of fighting was stronger than belief. Then slowly it stopped. By May 8th, the last shots were fired near the village of Bleiding. The German guns fell silent. The Red Army advanced cautiously, expecting traps, but there were none. What they found instead were hundreds of thousands of exhausted soldiers standing in the mud, rifles stacked neatly, waiting for orders that would never come. At the village of Eza, a Soviet officer read the terms of surrender. Around him stood the last German generals of Army Group Courland, ragged, hollow-eyed men who had commanded ghosts. Among them was General Karl Hilpert, who now bore the impossible duty of surrendering what remained of the 16th and 18th Armies. When he signed the order, he simply said, "The war is over. We have done our duty. The rest is silence." That afternoon, more than 180,000 men laid down their weapons in a single day, one of the largest mass surrenders in modern history. By the week's end, the number had reached 500,000. Rows of soldiers stretched for miles across the open fields, their helmets glinting faintly in the grey light. No one spoke. They simply marched, toward Soviet lines, toward captivity, toward the unknown. The Red Army gathered them in makeshift camps near Kuldiga and Saldus. Food was scarce, water came from melted snow. Many collapsed from exhaustion before reaching the pens of barbed wire. The Soviets divided them by rank and specialty. Officers were separated, interrogated, and transporting east. Most were never seen again. Ordinary soldiers were marched in columns toward rail stations, endless processions vanishing into the forests, their breath rising in clouds as they shuffled forward under guard. From there, the trains carried them east into the Soviet Union, into camps whose names no one in Germany had ever heard of: Vorkuta, Norilsk, Kirov, Sverdlovsk. For the soldiers of Courland, the war would not end in May 1945. For many, it would last 10 more years. Some of those who survived later spoke of that moment, the surrender, the silence afterward, the strange emptiness that followed. One recalled, "We waited for the Soviets to shoot us. When they didn't, we began to cry. We weren't relieved. We were lost." Another wrote from a Soviet labor camp in 1947. "I think we are still in Courland. It feels the same, the cold, the hunger, the waiting." In the forests and marshes they left behind, the traces of war began to sink into the earth. Abandoned tanks lay half-buried in mud, their metal slowly rusting. Graves without names dotted the fields. Latvian villagers who returned found their homes burned, their wells poisoned, their churches shattered by artillery. For years after the war, farmers unearthed helmets, bones, and weapons from the thawing soil. Sometimes they found entire bunkers, perfectly preserved beneath layers of ice, rifles stacked neatly, coffee mugs still on the table, a diary frozen open to the last page. By 1950, when the last German prisoners began to return from Soviet captivity, the world had already forgotten Courland. There were no parades, no honors. Only memories of a place that had been erased from maps, a pocket of time where winter never ended, and 500,000 men had fought for a country that no longer existed. The Soviets called it Kurlandski Kotel, the Courland Cauldron. The Germans called it Der Courland Kessel. To both sides, it was a grave. And to the historians who came later, it was something stranger, a paradox of war. A massive, self-contained battlefield that achieved nothing, changed nothing, but consumed thousands of lives all the same. On cold days, fishermen on the Baltic still dredge up relics from the seabed: helmets, rifles, bones. Sometimes, rusted metal appears along the coast after a storm, the last ghosts of an army swallowed by time. The men of Courland didn't vanish into myth. They vanished into the earth, into the ice, into the silence of a war that had already ended everywhere else. The guns fell silent. The snow melted. But the silence that followed the surrender of the Courland pocket was not peace. It was an echo, long, hollow, and heavy, with everything left unsaid. 500,000 men had fought in those forests. Only a fraction would ever return. In May 1945, the Baltic coast was grey with smoke. Soviet soldiers moved through the wreckage of trenches, collecting rifles, gathering prisoners, and marking the battlefield with red flags. The war was over. But for the soldiers of Army Group Courland, it had only changed shape. The men were disarmed, lined up in endless rows, and ordered to march. Columns stretched for miles, grey uniforms blending with the muddy horizon. Some carried their wounded on makeshift stretchers. Others limped barefoot, their boots long since frozen to pieces. No one spoke. The silence was its own kind of exhaustion. One witness, a Latvian farmer who watched the surrender from his barn, later said, "They did not look defeated. They looked empty, like shadows walking." The Soviets divided the prisoners by category: soldiers to labor, officers to interrogation, SS to punishment. Many expected they'd be held for a few months and sent home once Germany rebuilt. They were wrong. Within weeks, the first trains began to leave Latvia. Thousands were packed into cattle cars, 30, 40, 50 men per wagon, with a single hole in the floor for a toilet. There was little food, less water, and almost no air. The journey east took weeks. They traveled through Russia's endless forests, past villages that stared at them in silence, through tunnels where the smoke choked them until they fainted. Some never made it out of the wagons. The survivors found themselves in the labor camps of the Soviet far north: Vorkuta, Kolimar, Perm, Norilsk. Names that would later come to symbolize the Gulag system itself. They dug coal, cut timber, built railroads through frozen tundra. They worked in temperatures of 40 degrees C, wearing the same thin coats they had surrendered in. Every morning, guards counted them. Every evening, they counted again. The numbers never matched. Letters from home took months, sometimes years, to arrive, if they arrived at all. Many of the prisoners' families believed their sons were dead. Their names never appeared on official casualty lists. The men of Courland had become what one Soviet officer called the Invisible Army. Among them were generals who had commanded divisions, doctors who had tended the wounded, engineers who once built tanks, and boys who had never held a rifle before the final year of the war. They now shoveled coal side by side. One prisoner, Erich Sommer, wrote later, "The day I saw my reflection in the ice, I realized I was no longer a soldier. The war had taken everything, my rank, my country, even my name. I was just another man in grey." Some tried to escape. Most didn't get far. The Siberian wilderness was vast and empty, more deadly than any battlefield. Those who fled were often found frozen, miles from the camp, their footprints vanishing into snowdrifts. Others clung to faith, writing diaries on scraps of paper, recording dates, names, temperatures, as if order could still exist somewhere. A single entry found decades later in a camp near Sverdlovsk read simply, "January 3rd, 1947. Still alive. The snow has no end." Back in Germany, no one spoke of Courland. The war's survivors returned from the east slowly, in small groups, between 1949 and 1955. Some stepped off the trains looking decades older than their years. Others never made it home at all. When they spoke of the war, people didn't understand. How could an entire army fight until the very end, after Berlin fell, after Hitler died, for nothing? Even the new German government avoided the subject. Courland wasn't a story of heroism or victory. It was a story of silence, and silence doesn't fit neatly into history books. But for the men who had lived it, it never ended. Many could still hear the crack of ice under their boots, the sound of Katyusha rockets in the distance, the whisper of the Baltic wind through the pines. Some woke screaming in the night, believing they were back in their frozen trenches. Others never spoke of it again. In Latvia, traces of the battle remained everywhere. Children in the 1950s played with unexploded shells as toys. Fishermen found helmets tangled in their nets. The forests were full of shallow grave. Even today, when the spring thaw comes, the ground sometimes gives up its dead, bones in grey uniforms, dog tags still hanging from rusted chains. Local volunteers call them the sleepers. They rebury them with crosses and prayers, even when no one knows their names. For decades, Soviet propaganda described the Courland campaign as a triumph of liberation, the final step in driving the German fascists from the Baltics. But buried in those same archives are reports from Red Army officers who were horrified by what they saw. Entire villages burned by shellfire. Thousands of unburied corpses in the woods. Prisoners starving in open fields. One Soviet captain wrote, "It is not victory that lives here. It is only the cold." After the collapse of the Soviet Union, when historians gained access to one's secret archives, they were stunned by the scale of it. 30 divisions trapped, 6 major battles, hundreds of thousands of prisoners, yet barely a mention in the grand histories of the war. Courland had been erased, not hidden by conspiracy, but simply swallowed by the enormity of World War II. Stalingrad had its glory. Normandy had its films. But Courland had nothing but silence. In 2004, a Latvian farmer uncovered an intact bunker near Saldus. Inside were the remains of 4 German soldiers, their rifles stacked neatly, a typewriter rusted but still legible, and a diary frozen to a wooden table. The last line read, "If anyone finds this, tell them we fought here. Tell them we were still alive." That line became the title of a small museum exhibit, "We Were Still Alive." Visitors come every year, Germans, Latvians, Russians, standing in front of rusted helmets and faded photographs, trying to imagine what it felt like to be forgotten by the world. Today, satellite images still reveal faint outlines of trenches, roads carved into forests, and shapes beneath the soil where tanks once burned. The sea near Liepāja occasionally uncovers fragments of wreckage, pieces of ships that tried to ferry supplies to the pocket in its final days. Divers sometimes find human remains inside, a boot, a medal, a flask engraved with initials. They call them the soldiers of the deep. In total, historians estimate that more than 150,000 German soldiers died in Courland. Another 180,000 were captured, and tens of thousands simply disappeared, lost in retreat, buried by snow, or swallowed by the Baltic. No precise numbers exist. Perhaps that's fitting. The Courland pocket was never about numbers. It was about endurance, a kind of grim loyalty that outlived logic. The men who fought there weren't heroes or villains. They were remnants of a collapsing world, obeying orders long after those who gave them were dead. In the decades since, the forests have reclaimed everything. Grass grows over the bunkers. Moss covers the trenches. Only the wind still sounds the same, carrying across the hills the same haunting emptiness that once carried gunfire. And if you stand there today, in the silence, you can almost imagine it. The echo of marching boots fading into snow. The low rumble of distant artillery swallowed by the forest. the ghost of a soldier looking east, waiting for a dawn that never came. They called it the Courland Pocket. History calls it a footnote. But for the men who fought there, it was the end of the world. An army buried beneath the ice. A memory lost to time. And a reminder that sometimes, even in victory, war only leaves silence.